Welcome everybody to today's HoUSed call. I'm going to give it about a minute for people to have time to log in, and then we'll get started. Thank you. Still going to give it about 30 seconds for people to get logged in to today's call. So we'll be starting just shortly. Okay, everybody, welcome to today's National HoUSed Campaign call on achieving universal, stable, affordable housing. I'm Paul Keeley. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. We're so glad to have you join us today. Today will be a great call. We will be discussing what is going on with Build Back Better and how you can reach your members of Congress and urge them to include the historic housing investments in the Build Back Better Act at the scale that is really critically needed to address America's housing crisis. Also on the agenda today, Catherine Levine Einstein of Boston University will join the call to share the results of a survey of mayors' perceptions of homelessness in their cities and what they can do about it. We will also discuss NLIHC's newly updated database of multifamily and affordable housing properties covered by the CARES Act 30-day eviction notice requirement. We will get the latest from NLIHC's End Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions project and receive updates from the field. And Sarah Hasmer with the National Women's Law Center will join the call to share a recent analysis of the US Census Pulse Survey data on housing insecurity and its impacts on people by race, ethnicity, and gender. So great call today. I just want to again remind everybody that if you have questions for any of the presenters or panelists, please enter them in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen. You can also use the chat box, but think of that as your opportunity to communicate with others on the call. So I will generally be looking at the Q&A box for questions to our presenters. So if you have a question, be sure to include it there. I will also just remind everybody, we send an email out to all participants after the call with a recording of the call, all of the PowerPoint presentations. So often we get questions during the call saying, will these PowerPoints be shared? Yes, they will be shared. We will be sharing those out. Links to reports that are discussed will be in that follow-up email, and that'll come out sometime tomorrow. So just want to let you know that all of that information will be available to you after the call. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And I will invite our Senior Vice President for Public Policy, Sarah Sadian, to give us the latest on Build Back Better, the appropriations, and what we need advocates to do now. Take it away, Sarah.
Paul. Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It's good to see everybody on today's call. I'll start with Build Back Better, and then we'll talk a little bit about appropriations. So I think all of us have a level of frustration here because Senator Manchin is continuing to put cold water on efforts to revive Build Back Better and slowing down the process. The latest is that over the weekend, he said that Democrats should have to go through the committee process to work on this reconciliation bill. He said that Republicans should have input, even if they ultimately aren't going to vote for the bill. And nobody really expects Republicans to vote for the bill. So it's an intriguing suggestion that he has that it should go through committee. As you know, Democrats are planning to go through the budget reconciliation process, which would allow them to pass the bill in the Senate with just 50 votes, meaning that they wouldn't need Republican support, because otherwise, if it went through the regular process, they would need 60 votes, and that would require Republicans. So the fact that he's saying that it needs to go through committee process indicates that he wants to slow this process down even further. He also said that Congress should be focusing on other priorities first, like passing the spending bill for fiscal year 22. Again, he's putting distance between Congress and the ability to get this done more quickly. But while Senator Manchin is pushing for things to slow down, it seems like House Democrats, at least, including both progressives and moderates, are warning that the slower this process takes, the more at risk it'll be for the package to pass at all. And they warn that if you see too long of a delay, it might stop efforts or prevent Congress from being able to revive those negotiations. Progressives, who are led by Representative Jayapal, have called for March 1st to be the deadline for trying to get things back on track. They want the president to be able to, promote whatever sort of agreement they reach at the State of the Union address, which is on that evening. So there's some tension there about the timing that hasn't been resolved yet. I do think that it seems like House Democrats are still very optimistic that something will be passed, something will finally get enacted, but it doesn't seem like anybody has a very clear vision about exactly what that will be, which is why it's incredibly important for advocates to be using this time to continue to weigh in with your senators and your representatives in support of the housing investments in Build Back Better, and especially the historic investments in rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund. We do know that whatever does pass is likely to be scaled back from the full Build Back Better agenda. We know that the White House is very much focused on its 4 priorities, which are pre-K, childcare, climate change, and health provisions, and not housing. So if we are gonna if we want to keep housing in this bill, we're going to have to be extremely engaged and very consistently reaching out to our members of Congress and telling them that this is important and explain to them why these investments would help people in our communities. And we want to make sure specifically that when they're talking about housing, that we're making sure it's part of any reconciliation bill that passes. I mentioned before that we can pass a reconciliation bill with just a simple majority in the Senate. But there's been some talks of repackaging anything that doesn't make it into the reconciliation bill into some other bills. But it's really important that folks know that the only path forward this year to pass substantial resources for housing is through a reconciliation bill. And so if housing is not included in that and it's put into a separate bill, it really means that we're not going to see it enacted this year. So we have one vehicle, which is our best and only vehicle for getting housing resources, and it's this reconciliation bill. So we have a lot of work ahead of us to make sure that that stays in there. I also want to talk a little bit about appropriations. Just now, maybe about 10-15 minutes ago, we saw that the House released a bill that would extend the continuing resolution through March 11th. So it gives appropriators a little bit more time to work through negotiations. But I wanted to share a little bit of more background about why are we here? Why is it so delayed to get these appropriation bills across the finish line? And essentially that's because Republicans are holding this spending bill hostage while they push for deep cuts to all domestic programs, but including housing programs. So Republicans have been threatening a full year CR. And part of the reason why they're doing that is to try to attempt to bring down the overall spending for domestic programs, right? We know that a continuing resolution just carries over funding levels from the previous year, meaning Trump level funding levels from last year. And that means that there wouldn't be an opportunity like the House has proposed for really robust increases to housing programs. The Republicans, they want this full CR, or some Republicans want this full year CR precisely because it would call for a cut to domestic programs. I think we've talked about a little bit before, but I want to share a little bit more about why a CR is so dangerous for housing programs specifically. But I mentioned that a CR carries over funding levels from the previous year, but a lot of housing programs need an increase every year just to keep up with inflation. So if we're seeing, for example, rents increase in our communities or building costs increase in our communities, that means that Congress needs to provide a little bit more funding every year just to make sure we're having the same level of service as we have before. And so if you're keeping funding levels the same, but your rental costs are going up, your building costs are going up, it really acts like a cut. And it means that we're not providing as many services as we could or serving as many people as we could. So for rental assistance, for example, our folks at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities estimate that in all, if there was a full year CR, we could be looking at 100,000 fewer vouchers serving people who are currently being served, right? So the question would be, maybe we could capture those vouchers over turnover. I'm not exactly sure how that would play out. That's a huge number. But the point here to raise is that this is not just level funding from last year. It really is a cut, and it would have a direct impact on people who are in need of rental assistance and all the other programs that HUD offers. I also think what's important here is that at the same time that we have this big risk of a long-term CR, where we could lose 100,000 vouchers, on the table, there is a proposal for 125,000 more vouchers. So the difference between the two is about 225,000 vouchers, 225,000 households that could be served. You can see that there's a big difference between what's proposed in the House and what could be at risk if there was a long-term CR. So in terms of timing, we saw earlier, like I said, 20 minutes ago, the House released their bill text to extend the CR through March 11th. They could vote on that as soon as tomorrow. And then it would go over to the Senate side. This is likely intended to give appropriators a little bit more time to figure out and negotiate over their spending bills. That means that we have a small but important window of time where we can influence those discussions and make the case for why we need as many housing resources as possible. So really right now is a really critical time for you to be weighing in with your members of Congress. And in this case, especially your Republican members of Congress, to tell them that cuts to housing programs through a full year CR are unacceptable, that we can't hold back negotiations, and that they need to pass a final spending bill with really robust resources for housing in it. In terms of, so this is wrapping up appropriations for FY22. For FY23, that process hasn't begun yet. The White House has signaled that they're likely to start that process by releasing their budget request around March 1st when the State of the Union is happening, but that could be delayed a little bit. It already has been a little bit delayed, but not unsurprising given all the stuff that Congress and the administration have on their plate right now. So we should have more information next week about how things are moving along, but it's critically important. I just want to remind everybody to continue to engage on Build Back Better, to continue to press your members of Congress and encourage them to have to support publicly and to support by weighing in with their leadership and with the White House about the need for robust housing resources, and then also to do advocacy around this FY22 spending bill, where they're going to make really important decisions about how much funding HUD gets in this coming year and whether or not they're going to take the House proposal to expand vouchers to another 125,000 households. And with that, I'll turn it back to Paul.
Thanks, Sarah. So I have a question for you. Is there any effort to try to use the statistics that came out in the Washington Post last week that rents increased, average rents increased 14% last year. And in some cities, the rent increases were 40% last year. To sell Manchin on the idea, when he says he's always so concerned about inflation, that the construction provisions in the housing construction provisions in Build Back Better are absolutely essential to put a brake on inflation for the lowest income households. Is there any thought that that could be an avenue for convincing him to get on board?
Yeah, there has been more, I think, calls in the past couple of weeks pointing to those inflation numbers and the need for housing investments. There's a great article in the Washington Post written by Jim Parrott and Mark Sandy that I shared with every congressional office, showing or making the argument for why housing investments would directly tackle those inflationary issues. We've sent that to Manchin's office as well. But there's also an argument there, not just for Build Back Better resources, but resources in the FY22 budget as well. If we see that there's this huge increase in rents in our communities, but we're not funding housing programs in the appropriations bill at the level necessary, it means it's really acting as an even deeper cut than it would otherwise be to those programs. So I mentioned before, we often see that vouchers need a little bit of more funding every year just to keep up with inflation. But this year it becomes even more important if we're seeing rents increase by 14%.
Great, thanks, Sarah. There's a question here from Scott Bernstein. Are there congressional champions for the unlocking possibilities zoning reform provision in Build Back Better?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a relatively smaller program that's in the Build Back Better portfolio of housing investments. It's really aimed at giving planning and implementation grants to local communities that want to tackle their zoning and land use restrictions. I really think the biggest champion on that is Senator Klobuchar, who drafted a very similar bill. I can't remember the name of her bill, but I think that the provision in Build Back Better really comes from some of her thinking around zoning.
There was a question also about what the source of the estimate of 100,000 fewer vouchers under a year-long CR, and that's the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I don't know if you know anything more about how they calculated that you want to share or you can share, Sarah.
That's hot off the presses, very back of the envelope calculations, but it's compared to what happens if there was a full year CR compared to what is being proposed in the Senate bill. The Senate bill, if you recall, provides a modest increase in funding for HUD programs, but it doesn't go nearly as far as the House proposal does. That's why we're calling for the House proposal to expand vouchers by 125,000 to 125,000 more individuals and households. So it's comparing what is probably a most conservative likely outcome for appropriations this year with a full year CR.
Great. One more question for now. Let's see. And then we have to move on. The question is, what is being done to mobilize an advocacy effort by Manchin's constituents in West Virginia? Are there any town hall meetings, for example?
That's a great question. I know that we've had Paige and others from our West Virginia state partner on this call before, and for the call for our legislative working group. So I can provide a little details, but we'll have to check in with Paige to get an update there. I know that they're doing a lot of work with folks in other sectors as well, not just to push for housing resources, but to press Manchin on the need to pass the bill overall. They've been doing radio ads and billboard ads, trying to work cross-sector in a way that puts as much pressure on them as possible. Not sure about town halls, but we'll have to follow back up with Paige and get more details.
All right, fantastic. Sarah, there are a couple more questions we just don't have time to get to right now. If you could just take a look at those and maybe you could answer them after you go off camera here, that would be great. There are also, I just want to mention, maybe a question or two that we might hold for our VP for research at the coalition about pulse data. I'm going to hold off on that one. There's another one that might be best for our erase team. So maybe we'll hold that until later in the call, or somebody on the NLIHC team can respond. All right, very good, thank you. And now we will move on to the next presenter in our agenda. And that is Catherine Levine Einstein from Boston University. And I believe she will be presenting. She's also joined by a colleague, Charlie Willison from Cornell University, talking about mayors and America's homelessness crisis. So I will turn it over to you, Catherine. Catherine, are you there? Oh, there you are. Just need to unmute yourself. It's not working, huh? I'm going to just see if on our side, is there a way that we can unmute Catherine? We can see her, but she's having trouble unmuting. Not sure what that.
Got it. Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
All right.
Great.
Something about the share screen messed with it. All right, sorry about that, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to presenting some of the work that Charlie and I have worked on homelessness. So I'm an associate professor of political science at Boston University, and my wonderful co-author, Charlie Willison, is an associate professor or an assistant professor in public health at Cornell. Next slide. I don't appear to have control over these slides, so I don't know if, there we go. Thank you so much. We have been working for 8 years at the BU Initiative on Cities on the Menino Survey of Mayors. And it's the only nationally representative academic survey of mayors. And it's been going since 2014 with the generous support of Citi and the Rockefeller Foundation. This year, we have dug in for the first time into homelessness policy with the generous support of Community Solutions. My other co-principal investigators at Boston University are David Glick and Max Palmer, and Charlie has been my amazing intellectual partner in this homelessness research. Next slide. So we target cities with populations over 75,000, and we interviewed 126 mayors this year, which is a response rate of over 25%. And one of the really unique features of the Menino survey is we conduct all of our interviews in person or over the phone. So we are not talking with chiefs of staff or other mayoral officials who are obviously really important people to talk to as well, but we're able to get a direct sense of the mayors and their policy priorities. We always check for representativeness on a number of different dimensions, including partisanship and other mayoral demographics, as well as city level demographics. Next slide. So the Menino survey covers a wide variety of topics. I'm happy to answer folks' questions offline if they want to know about some of the other areas. And you can see in the chat a link to some of our other reports on our website. But today I'm really going to dig into some of our results on housing from our recently released homelessness report. Next slide. And I'll start with our results on accountability. So I don't need to justify to anyone in this room that local politicians have a really important influence over homelessness policy. They control how much housing gets built and where it gets built. They control whether governments pursue punitive or harm reduction policy. And they also control how and where homelessness policy gets administered. Next slide. So I'll talk a bit about some of our results for accountability and capacity. Next slide. So we asked the mayors how accountable they feel for addressing homelessness in their city. And a strong majority, 73%, perceive themselves as being held highly accountable. And this is true for cities across a variety of different demographic characteristics. Next slide. While they perceive themselves as being held accountable, mayors also feel that they have very little control over homelessness in their city. Only 19% of mayors feel that they have a great deal or a lot of control over addressing homelessness. And this is true for a lot of different policy areas. Local leaders feel really buffeted by a wide variety of challenges over which they feel they have relatively little control. Next slide. We asked mayors about barriers to homelessness and how much they felt a variety of different characteristics were serious barriers. And one that stood out to us is limited funding. So you can see here the number of mayors that select that dark blue a lot category. As researchers, we always look to see when mayors opt in to sort of an extreme response category to sort of get a sense of the intensity of their views. And what we can see is that mayors are deeply concerned about limited funding funding for addressing homelessness in their communities. Other factors that they cite as important include public opposition to new housing and shelters, limited human and social services, and a lack of coordination between government and social service agencies. Next slide. There's some important differences along partisan lines that you can see here. So for example, 63% of Democratic mayors worry about a lack of coordination between different government and social service agencies, compared with only 28% of Republican mayors. Mayors also differ along partisan lines in the extent to which they see evictions as a significant barrier to reducing homelessness. But I actually stress, having done this survey now for almost a decade, relative to some other policy areas like climate change or racial discrimination, these partisan gaps are actually fairly small. There's a fair amount of bipartisanship on our homelessness questions, and a number of homelessness questions that we asked where mayors indicated a pretty strong amount of agreement across party lines. Next slide. We also asked mayors about who were sort of the biggest influencers of their homelessness policy. And unsurprisingly, nearly all mayors described the local nonprofit community as important influencers of local homelessness policy. Perhaps somewhat more surprisingly and somewhat concerningly, the police also play an important role in shaping homelessness policy. So 78% of mayors say that the police have at least some influence over their city's homelessness policy, which is actually slightly more than for people experiencing homelessness. So these are important drivers of homelessness policy in many communities. Next slide. So we asked an open-ended question of the mayors about their staffing for homelessness. And this was just to get a sense of sort of how they manage their local bureaucracies. And what we found first was that 28% of mayors actually have no staff at all dedicated to serving people experiencing homelessness, which clearly creates significant coordination challenges. Another result that jumped out to us was that over a fifth of mayors placed their homelessness staff in police departments. And this is true even in cities where the approach to homelessness, or at least the stated approach to homelessness, is one of harm reduction. And research on policing tells us that even in contexts where we assign the police more social service and harm reduction policy responsibilities, it can devolve into punitive responses. So this is potentially really problematic and may subvert many governments' aims in homelessness policy to have so much of the staffing take place within the police departments. Next slide. We asked mayors about data and coordination challenges. And so mayors largely struggling to get the data they need to evaluate homelessness. So 38% of mayors only have access to annual data. Another 35% collect monthly data. 3% of mayors, they're good on data. They get access to daily data. But 10%, and this is to us a really important minority of cities, say they actually have no access to city level data. And this is largely driven by their surrounding county governments being responsible for collecting homelessness data and then not sharing their data. So we asked a more general open-ended question about obstacles to collecting and using high-quality data around homelessness, and mayors highlighted coordination challenges with their counties, with their surrounding local governments, and with nonprofits. Next slide. So just one of the great things about the Menino survey, and for folks who are interested in digging into this, into the broader report, is that we're able to get these kind of open-ended elaborations from mayors and getting a real sense of sort of, in this case, some of their very fraught relationships with their county governments. And I flag that this is not just an issue for homelessness, but for a variety of other policy areas as well. Next slide. Mayors also struggled with coordinating with their local nonprofit sector. So they said that they sometimes had local homelessness shelters that couldn't share their data or wouldn't share their data, right? Which obviously also contributes to potentially an inaccurate picture around homelessness in their communities. Next slide. Finally, we also asked mayors how they defined success in addressing homelessness. Next slide. So we asked this open-ended question of mayors, how they define success, and then coded it in a couple of different ways. And one of the interesting things in asking these kinds of open-ended questions is we can get a sense of how much mayors have really thought about a particular issue in depth. So for some types of open-ended questions, the mayors will have an answer at the ready, like right off the top of their heads. And other times it takes them a little bit longer. There's a little more humming and hawing in coming up with an answer. And this question, somewhat surprisingly to us, was a question where there was some more humming and hawing, where a lot of times we asked it and they would say something like, huh, I haven't really thought about that before. And so that's notable to us too, that this is an area where I think local leaders could use a lot of support and guidance. So one way that we coded this question was asking the mayors whether they had a reduction goal or not. And 60% of mayors actually said that they did not have a reduction goal when it came to addressing homelessness. There was some variation by demographic of city, but overall, majority of mayors did not cite a reduction goal when describing their definition of success in addressing homelessness. Next slide. We also coded by priority area, sort of how mayors define success, and 42% of them highlighted getting people into housing as their key definition of success. Another 16% of people highlighted getting people matched to appropriate mental health or addiction services. An important minority of mayors, 11%, centered the needs of non-homeless residents. They defined success in terms of reducing complaints or broader externalities. So we would hear from mayors who would talk about not getting complaints from their local businesses, or clearing encampments so they wouldn't have to hear complaints from their residents. So again, this is not all mayors or even a majority of mayors, but we believe this is an important minority of mayors who are really centering those kinds of complaints in thinking about success in homelessness. Next slide. And again, these quotes provide, I think, a nice elaboration of these results. And you can see the mix of responses where some mayors are clearly following more of a housing first approach and talking about matching people with housing and getting people into housing as a key metric of success. And others talking about eliminating homeless encampments in order to reduce complaints from local residents. Next slide. Just to conclude, local governments are critical partners in reducing homelessness, but they are often left without staff, data, and financial tools to address key challenges. They frequently resort to police as policy implementers, and intergovernmental coordination is a significant challenge. Mayors need better data and clear measurement standards for success. So thank you so much, and thank you for bearing with the technological mishaps, and I look forward to answering your questions. And again, please feel free to email if you have things you want to discuss further.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That is such great research and very well presented. It's so clear. And of course, we see all of us on this call, we're really pushing for the resources that these mayors are really across the board saying their number one need is additional resources to meet the need, and the housing resources that we're pushing for would obviously go a long way. So one question we do have here is what is the percent of mayors that answered the surveys? Can you give us a little bit of taste of that?
Yeah, sure. I just typed it into the chat box. It's 25%, which is the response rate that we get in typical years. And it can be helpful to get a benchmark for that. So elite surveys is like this kind of annoying jargon term that social scientists use to basically talk about surveying anyone other than members of the general public. So politicians, people from advocacy organizations, community groups. Typically, when we survey anyone other than the general public, we get response rates around there between 20 and 30%. When people survey the general public, the response rates are down to like 5%. It's a huge problem in survey research.
Right. So there is a question here about, can we have a copy of your slides? And as I said at the top of the call, yes, we will provide a copy of the slides, a link to the copy of the slides in our follow-up email. So you'll be able to get these, and they are really just fantastic. There's a question up here that really wasn't asked about your presentation, and really doesn't have to do with your survey and the study, but just curious if you know, there's a question here, is there data of the numbers of first-time homeless population state and nationally from rent evictions? Would you happen to know the answer to that question?
I don't. Charlie, do you know that off the top of your head?
I do not. As obviously mentioned in our presentation, data around homelessness is a big issue. I'm sure as everyone on this call knows, especially with the ways in which that we count homelessness. So thinking about the point in time counts versus continuous estimates and knowing really who's experiencing homelessness or who's at risk. And the continuums of care and other research that Dr. Einstein and I are doing have been experiencing this this growing proportion of people who are now at risk of homelessness who had never been experiencing those risks as a result of the economic constraints from the pandemic. And so I think, I don't know, I'm sure others on this call probably know where we might get a better sense of that data, but as far as thinking about the separation of data between the continuums of care, the nonprofits and local governments in this new expansion of the role of evictions in creating people who are now at risk, we think there's probably at least not sufficient data around these numbers.
Great, thank you. There's one more question, then we'll move on. Did you also evaluate the responses by different city sizes? Were there any kind of notable distinctions between large cities, small cities, and so forth?
Yeah, this was a policy area. So just to give a backdrop, for every single question we ask on this survey, we check for differences across a number of both mayoral demographic traits and city level demographic traits. And so we look at population, housing costs, racial demographics, as well as mayoral partisanship, and when possible, mayoral race. That can be hard sometimes because of sort of small cell sizes. But the big takeaway is we actually didn't really find consistent differences by city size here. And again, for most of our homelessness questions, I think the thing that stood out to us as researchers was that there was more commonalities across different types of cities than there were differences. And I want to come home again to that partisanship point, because I was just analyzing some other data from the mayor's survey about race, where the gap between Democratic and Republican mayors on some of our racial discrimination questions was like 50 or 60 percentage points. It's huge. For homelessness, it's small in most cases. It's under 20 percentage points. We have a few questions where it went up between 20 and 30 percentage points, but this is an area where I think there's a lot of agreement among mayors about the need for more resources. So it's exciting that you all are working towards that incredibly important goal. It's something that our local leaders really feel like they need.
Outstanding. So it looks like there are a few more questions. If you have a chance to stay on and just maybe respond to some of these questions online, that would be really helpful. But thank you so much for this presentation. Really outstanding work and a very clear presentation that you provided to us today. Thank you so much. Okay, we will move on now to our next presenter, who is our very own Andrew Oren, Vice President for Research at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, to talk about our updated database on properties covered by CARES Act 30-day eviction notice requirements. So Andrew, take it away.
Sure, thanks, Paul. I'm just going to take a few minutes to tell you about this update. As many, if not all of you know, the CARES Act that was enacted in 2020 included the temporary federal eviction moratorium that's no longer in effect, and it provided money like coronavirus relief funds and CDBG-CV that could be used for emergency rental assistance. But the other provision in this CARES Act was a permanent requirement of landlords of federally financed properties to provide a 30-day notice prior to filing an eviction for non-payment of rent. And that provision is still in effect. It's permanent federal policy, or at least until it's ever repealed by legislation. And that 30-day notification rule applies to all properties that receive some form of federal financial support. And so that includes properties that have mortgages secured by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, that have FHA insured mortgages, and of course it includes properties that receive subsidies like project-based rental assistance, low-income housing tax credit, National Housing Trust Fund, and other federal subsidy programs. Because the CARES Act covers properties that have Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae mortgages, we estimate that the rule covers probably somewhere between 30 to 35% of renters. And I just posted a thing in the data. I posted a link to the database in the chat. Anyway, it's important, the notification rule, because the 30-day notification period is longer than what's required by most states. Prior to the pandemic, only 9 states had a notification period that was longer than 10 days. You know, of course, there's stronger tenant protections that we would like to see happen. And, you know, thankfully, we're seeing sprout up across the US, like right to counsel, for example, comes to mind, that is spreading. And we talked about those protections last week or the previous week, and also in a recent report that we released. But the 30-day notification rule, you know, where stronger protections aren't in place, this rule at least slows down the eviction process, giving tenants some more time to fight their eviction. As many of you know, a challenge with the CARES Act was knowing which properties are covered by the act, and that's where our database comes into play. You know, it's not easy for tenants to know if their properties are covered by the CARES Act and by the 30-day rule. So earlier this month, we updated our database of multifamily properties that are covered by the CARES Act. You can find it at the link that I just put into the chat, and you can simply type in your zip code or town, and you'll see a list of the multifamily properties that are covered. The database includes about 160,000 properties that account for at least or more than 10 million apartments. And we know that some legal aid organizations are using the database to try to make sure that this 30-day notification rule is enforced. You know, last fall, the National Housing Law Project did a survey and found that 58% of legal aid respondents to the survey said that enforcement of federal eviction notice requirements was inconsistent. And another 20% said that there was no enforcement. And so hopefully this database will, you know, remind everyone that the federal 30-day notification requirement is in place, and you can find out what properties, or at least multifamily properties, are covered by in our database. One thing I do need to point out, unfortunately, the database is not comprehensive. It does not have data on single family rentals and on properties that have fewer than 5 units. Those properties are also covered by the CARES Act and the 30-day notification rule, but data about those properties is not readily available from Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, and so we have not been able to incorporate them into the database. And I believe the Urban Institute estimates that there's about nearly 3 million, like 2.8 million rental units that are likely in these smaller properties that are covered by the CARES Act. And I think I will just leave it at that. Again, just a reminder that this 30-day rule is in place. It's a new permanent federal policy. And hopefully, we know that it is enforced in a very spotty way now, but hopefully, you know, it can be better enforced.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that and for the updated database, which is an incredibly important resource for advocates and service providers. Please avail yourselves of that. There is a question here from Linda Seltzer. What types of evictions does this cover? And when did this take effect?
It covers evictions based on non-payment of rent. And it took effect in 2020 when the CARES Act was enacted. It really didn't come into play until after the federal eviction moratorium was lifted, though.
Okay, very good. Andrew, I don't see other questions about this, although Linda,
actually, I see one question in the chat that I do want to say, and you know, I think I may have mentioned this, is Bonnie Stender made a comment here about how successful has it been, mentioned a colleague of hers, you know, where the 30-day rule, it looks like a judge had rejected it. And that has been an issue, sort of spotty enforcement of this rule. And I know like National Housing Law Project and other legal aid groups have been concerned about this and working on this. But it has been very, like we saw with the eviction moratorium, its enforcement has been spotty.
Okay, actually a couple of more questions have come in. Is the database downloadable?
It is not downloadable from our website, but if you're interested in data from a particular state, just email us and we'll gladly share it. If you email research@nlihc.org and just tell us what states you would like to know more about, we can share it with you.
And then somebody asked, what does null mean? I guess when they see that in the database.
It is a blank field. I'm trying to think now what column that would be in. It means it's a blank field for that particular property. We didn't know it.
Okay. And then there is a question again, this is not directly related to what you've just presented on, but because you're our Pulse expert, Linda Seltzer did put a question in the chat about Pulse data being used to estimate the total number of people facing eviction in Washington State based on the Pulse survey data. And I'm not going to ask you to answer that live, but you might want to just look at it in the chat. And if you could respond to what her question is in the chat, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I can answer in the chat. We did some quick math on the fly. I texted someone on the research team and they gave me, at least we know the national numbers. And so we can check with her and see if it is similar for Washington State and if those numbers are right.
All right, very good. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's always a pleasure having you on the call. Okay, we'll move on to the next item on our agenda, and that is Emma Foley, who's our research analyst here at the Coalition, will give us an update on the Erase project and ERA spending as of today. Emma, take it away.
Thanks, Paul. So first, I just wanted to provide a brief update on emergency rental assistance spending, and then speak a little bit about some of the trends we're seeing on program closures and wait lists. So regarding ERA spending, the Department of Treasury hasn't released new data since early last month, which contained spending data that was current through the end of November 2021. We expect spending data through the end of December to be released any day now, which will allow us to evaluate ERA spending progress through the first year of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. We also expect that the next round of reallocation will occur in the next month or so, and we'll be sure to provide an update when that occurs. As of now, using Treasury data, program dashboards, and communications with program administrators, we are tracking that 15.5 billion of ERA1 has been spent, representing 62% of the $25 billion ERA1 allocation. Of ERA2, we estimate that 3.8 billion has been spent, or nearly 18% of the ERA2 allocation. And ERA1 and ERA2 just refer to two different pots of money that were passed by. ERA1 was passed in the 2021 Consolidated Appropriations Act, and ERA2 was passed as a part of the American Rescue Plan. And NLIHC updates our spending estimates weekly at nlihc.org/ERA-dashboard. Next slide. Though a good portion of funds remain to be spent, many fast spending programs have begun shutting down as they've either paid or obligated nearly all of their ERA1 and ERA2 funds. This graph shows the number of programs that were closed or on hold each month since November 2021. Closed programs are ones that have shut down permanently, and programs on hold or with a wait list are ones that are not currently accepting applications, but may at a later date. The number of programs on hold in particular has been steadily increasing, and the number of programs on hold right now is more than double the number of programs that was on hold in November 2021. Next slide. Many of the programs on hold or closed are larger programs serving areas with large renter populations. So 8 of these are state programs, including Alaska, DC, Illinois, Minnesota, New Jersey, North Carolina, and Texas. And 69 programs are also closed or on hold, including some large cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, and Austin. There may be different reasons for programs to be on hold. For example, some programs might be updating their guidelines as they transition from ERA1 to ERA2 funds and expect to reopen. Other programs might have expended nearly all of their ERA1 and ERA2 funds, but are waiting to see if they receive reallocated funds from the Department of Treasury, in which case they may also be able to reopen. NLIHC's rental assistance lookup tool shows which programs are open, closed, and on hold, and is linked on this slide, and we can also pop that in the chat. NLIHC updates these fields regularly, but it's important to note that the status of these programs is subject to change somewhat frequently, given the changing situation with funding. So for example, the state of Oregon paused their program in December and reopened it in late January. So for households seeking assistance or anyone looking to see the status of their emergency rental assistance program, we recommend that you continue checking your program's website for funding availability given these frequent changes. Next slide. As more and more programs start to pause or close, NLIHC has noted several promising practices that programs should engage to continue supporting households in need of rental assistance. These include providing ample notice before closing, providing alternative resources for households looking for rental assistance, and collecting emails or names of potential applicants for programs that expect to reopen. Collecting emails or names can help notify potential applicants if a program does reopen that they can now submit an application. I've listed several examples here of programs that have implemented some of these practices. Texas, for example, has developed an extensive list of resources on their website and also links to local emergency rental assistance programs where applicants may still be able to receive assistance. New Jersey notified applicants that the program planned to close 1 month prior to the deadline. Chicago linked to their state's program for applicants to apply, and Austin has provided a place for applicants to sign up if more funding becomes available. Next slide. NLIHC continues to track emergency rental assistance program changes and spending in real time on both our dashboard and lookup tool. If you have any questions related to emergency rental assistance spending or changes, or if you know of something that has updated, do feel free to email us at research@nlihc.org. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Emma, for that great update. So Abby Ang had a couple of questions kind of related that I don't know if you know the answer to, but I'll ask them. Are there any updated stats on how many people are still waiting on rent relief? And if there's information on how many people nationally are on wait lists for rent relief?
Those are great questions. For the second question, I'm not sure if there's information on how many people are on wait lists for rent relief. The Department of Treasury does release data quarterly on how many applicants have applied to emergency rental assistance and how many people have received emergency rental assistance, which isn't necessarily wait list, but it does give us an idea of how many households are looking for assistance that haven't yet received it. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but I can pop a memo link in the chat that discusses this. And then for the first question, I would say, that's similar, people who are waiting on rent relief. There's also some new questions in the Census Pulse household pulse survey that asks respondents whether they applied for rent relief and if they've been denied or they're waiting or they received assistance. This was actually our fact of the week this week. And so I will also pop a link to that in the chat, which gives a high level idea of how many or what percent of applicants might still be waiting.
Great. I'll ask you one more question, Emma, before you go. There's a question from an attendee that asks, why do we have this dissonance between so much money still available and so many programs closing? Is this on the cities, the states, or the feds?
It's a good question. I think there's probably two main reasons. One is that some programs adopted a lot of really important flexibilities, like providing flexible documentation requirements where applicants can self-attest to meeting certain requirements rather than having to upload more burdensome documentation around things like income or COVID hardship. Programs that allowed direct-to-tenant assistance may have been able to get funding out faster to applicants whose landlords didn't want to participate. And so there's kind of a disparity between programs that implemented those best practices and might have been able to get funding out quicker than programs that didn't. And then another part of that is that the initial emergency rental assistance allocation formula provided disproportionately high amounts to some smaller states and disproportionately low amounts to some larger states and jurisdictions. And so we've seen a lot of the larger states that have spent their funding down really quickly and are now looking to fill that gap with reallocated funds. This includes states like New York, California, Texas, New Jersey, while some other states have only spent a very small portion of their funding, potentially because they received more than they might be able to spend.
Very good, Emma. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay, we'll move on to our field updates, and we will start with Kara Trattner from Way Home, Pennsylvania. Kara?
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I'm just testing if I can control the slides. So thanks everyone for having me and having us on here. It's really an honor to be joining you all today and to get to hear from all your good information earlier too. My name is Kara Trattner, and I'm the Housing Assistance Manager for our Way Home program at the organization SELF. We are in Philadelphia on Lenape land here, and I'm just gonna briefly share a little bit about our program. So we are a rapid rehousing program that was designed specifically for the LGBTQ community. We're wonderfully queer and trans, as you can see. Let's see. And for those, I'm guessing a lot of people here are familiar with rapid rehousing as a model, but it is designed to be a quick method to move people out of homelessness into permanent housing through rental assistance. And just to put it in the context of what we've been discussing here as well, this did come through ESG funding, through emergency solution grants, through CARES from HUD. So this program started a little over a year ago and is in its kind of pilot phase here. Some brief background on why housing is needed for the LGBTQIA community. This hopefully is not news to anyone here, but folks in the queer and trans community are much more likely to be homeless, and even among homeless folks are much more likely to be unsheltered. So you see here specifically that transgender adults, 63% are unsheltered, and 80% of gender nonconforming folks who are homeless are unsheltered. And this is just to say, there's a lot of barriers for specifically trans and non-binary folks in being able to access safe and appropriate shelter options and emergency housing, from barriers like being denied access to shelter at intake because of their gender identity, to being housed in a place that is gendered in a way that does not align with their gender identity. And also when folks are entering shelters, often have experiences of not being safe, of experiencing harassment, of not having staff who are trans competent, of not having a space that is really appropriate and that they're able to stay in safely. So we see a lot of people being on the street or in other situations of homelessness. And homelessness has actually been increasing since 2017 for transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. Part of this may just be a result of having more accurate ways to collect that data now. Homelessness has always been an issue in these communities for reasons we'll discuss, but also this problem does seem to be getting worse and not better. And that's part of the reason why a group of queer and trans advocates and service providers came together in Philly to advocate for a program specifically for this community. And some other unique barriers faced here, of course, homophobia, transphobia, heterosexism, and in all aspects of our society, including housing. There's a lot of data showing that people face discrimination when trying to apply for housing in the private market and also within service providers, and legal discrimination in accessing employment or benefits. Being kicked out as youth, 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ, which is a huge percentage. and just having less likely to have family support or social acceptance in other ways as well because of their gender identity. And this can lead to other risks as well, health risks. It's difficult for people to access trans competent medical providers or potentially hormone therapy or other resources that are needed. It's also, people are more likely to be targets of violence and hate crimes, and also to have experiences of trauma, which can then lead to higher rates of substance use or mental health issues. And of course, we can't talk about homophobia and transphobia without talking about how that intersects with racism, knowing that Black trans women experience the highest rates of violence in our communities and also the highest rates of homelessness and also criminalization. So we see higher rates of arrest and incarceration because of the way that gender and sexuality is also policed. And just, as I said, a lack of LGBTQ affirming emergency housing options. So for example, here in Philadelphia, the only emergency housing options designed specifically for LGBTQ community are recovery house options. So for people who aren't necessarily looking for a sober living space or who may not want to be in a recovery house environment or be appropriate for that, there aren't other options. Just for the sake of time, I won't talk too much about rapid rehousing, but these slides will be available. And essentially, as I shared, it's a model that we support people in finding landlords and apartments, in paying direct rental assistance, and in connecting to resources as needed. Our program offers 1 year of rental assistance. We do have a housing first model, so it's a low barrier model, and we have no preconditions, which is really essential to this model, that we're not screening people out for assistance based on the criteria that is assuming to predict successful outcomes, like whether they have income or employment, whether they have criminal history or any other mental health issues, or evidence that they're motivated or employable, because we really want this program to be reaching people who need it, and not only going to people who, might on paper seem like they would be successful, especially knowing that folks in the queer and trans community are particularly vulnerable and in need of this resource, but may face additional barriers, for example, to getting employment because of the discrimination they experience. So we pay for the full security deposit and move-in expenses, and then individuals in our program pay 30% of their income if they have income. And we pay the rest of their rent for that full first year. This one says a little shorter. Different rapid rehousing models have different timelines. Ours is 1 year. Eligibility is pretty simple. This is for adults, so people over 18. There are often resources, not as many as needed still, but for LGBTQ youth. And this is the only program specifically for adults in our area that's rapid rehousing for this community. Low income, and then literally homeless. So this particular ESG funded rapid rehousing has to be for people who are on the street or in a place not suitable for living, like a car or park, or in an emergency shelter. We do see a lot of people couch surfing. That's not something that makes someone eligible for this program, unfortunately, but that's a needed resource too. And as I said, we're trans competent, LGBTQ affirming by design in our model. We also aim to be anti-racist and bilingual and offer all our resources in Spanish as well. And our referrals come from our Office of Homeless Services from our city in Philadelphia. And we also really advocated for there to be a referral process directly from the community, from our community partners, and also just through peer outreach and on the street. We felt that was important, knowing that a lot of folks in this community, as I discussed before, are not necessarily going to be in the emergency shelter system and may not be already documented in the city's homeless service database, so might not otherwise have access to this. So we really wanted this to also be a direct pipeline for folks to gain access to housing options that they might not otherwise. So we have also worked with the city, thankfully, to be able to accept referrals directly from the community, and have seen a lot of queer and trans folks sharing this resource with each other and doing a lot of peer outreach. And this is my information. So thanks for your time, and I'll see if I can answer any questions here.
Excellent, excellent presentation. I'll echo Ryan Hannon, who said, great job presenting, Kara. That was really fantastic and so important. So just, you kind of touched on it just there, but maybe just if you could clarify what happens after the 1 year intervention.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that is, one thing about this model that is not ideal is there aren't always ways to extend the subsidy. And when people are paying 30% of their income, they're not always able to save. And as we've discussed earlier on this call, with the inflation of rent prices and housing, it's not always affordable. I will say we have been lucky so far that we have been able to connect people with other permanent housing subsidies, with some of the emergency housing vouchers that PHA put out recently, and with other options. And we just have a very strong commitment to support people through that transition and not returning to homeless. So, as we're seeing the first of our people hit that mark, we're doing everything we can to support them in getting other resources. Some of our people have increased their income and can maintain it as the model is designed after that on their own. Other people really need a bridge to other supports and services.
Kara, there are several other questions in the Q&A. I'm going to ask you one more, and then if you could just look at the others, and maybe you could type your answers to those individuals. But one maybe quick question is, can you share about how you got funding for this program?
Yeah, so again, this program funding came through ESG, through CARES Act funding, that we originally applied for funding directly through the city in Philadelphia.
Fantastic, great. Again, there are a few more. If you take a look at the Q&A box, that would be really helpful. But just in the interest of time, I think we'll move on to our next update. Thank you so much, Kara.
Thanks so much.
Okay. All right, for our next field update, we're going to go to Chloe Shiras, Program Manager, Initial Resettlement at HIAS. Chloe, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, and very excited to be here. Thank you for providing the space to discuss refugee resettlement as it relates to housing. So my name is Chloe Shiras. I'm the Program Manager for Initial Resettlement at HoUSed. And I think we can go on to the next slide. Great. So just to provide a little bit of background about U.S. refugee resettlement, because it can be a bit confusing. So HoUSed is one of 9 national resettlement agencies in the United States. We are all funded by the State Department Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, or PRM, to provide refugee resettlement services. And then each of the 9 resettlement agencies fund their affiliate partners, who are the local agencies on the ground who are welcoming refugees in their communities and providing all of the mandated services through the PRM funded program to welcome refugees to the United States. So HoUSed works in all of the listed cities that you see right there on the map. If you don't see your city, it's likely that one of the other 8 resettlement agencies provides resettlement services in your city. There are agencies really all throughout the country, but this is where HoUSed specifically works. So while HoUSed has typically been focused on refugee resettlement, due to the recent crisis in Afghanistan, we have been pivoting to also welcome the Afghans that have arrived in the United States through what's called the Afghan Placement and Assistance, or APA program. And these individuals were actually not provided refugee status, they were provided humanitarian parole. It's a different immigration status, but for the services of how HoUSed is working with these individuals, they have, the State Department has made it so that they are able to receive many of the same services that refugees receive when they first arrive. And one of those services that all of our affiliates will provide refugees and Afghan parolees is providing housing upon arrival. This is something that has always been difficult for refugees, for refugee resettlement agencies. But in the past year or so, it's actually really become a crisis situation for us and something that has been extremely difficult. The situation with Afghanistan highlighted that a little bit more, as we have welcomed more Afghan parolees in the last several months than refugees that we welcomed in the entire last year. So the pace at which we have welcomed these individuals into the United States has been much faster, which has resulted even more in this housing crisis that we're seeing. Can you go to the next slide, please? So I just want to explain a little bit of the challenges that we face in housing refugees and parolees and some of the impacts of that. So for refugee resettlement, there is very limited funds. So from the government, refugees receive $1,225 per person. That's not monthly, that's total, and that is to cover absolutely everything. So we try to cover the first 3 months of rent, but that also has to cover food until the clients receive food stamps, any furniture and housing needs that we don't get from donations, if there are any other emergency costs. All of this 1,225 is what the clients have. So if it's a family of 5, that's multiplied by 5. But if that's a single client, that's all they have. There are some additional funding options, both from the State Department and from donations that HoUSed receives. But generally, the base funding is this 1,225. And as you all can imagine, that goes very quickly. Another one of the biggest challenges is that refugees and parolees arrive to the United States with no US work history, rental history, or other history to satisfy a typical background check. These clients also do not have their social security cards immediately upon arrival. They do have them within a couple of weeks, but not right when they arrive. The next challenge has been the corporatization of the rental application process. So we've seen over the past several years that instead of working with some of the mom and pop landlords that we've typically been able to connect with, these landlords have now become more corporate, working with larger landlord companies, where instead of being able to really have that human connection of working with a landlord, there's now a computer that's deciding who's getting the rental unit and who's not, which has been weeding out the refugees and parolees, rather than having kind of that human connection of landlords saying, okay, we've worked with this agency in the past. We know that refugees and parolees deserve a place to live. We know that they've been good tenants in the past, and we'll work with you. We're also seeing that because of the lack of rental history, lack of work history, landlords are requiring co-signers, which is typically just not something that's possible for affiliate agencies to provide. The State Department does not co-sign for refugees that arrive here in the United States. And unless the refugee has a family member or a close friend here in the United States, it's extremely difficult to have a co-signer on these units. Lastly, another challenge we see is that we have some very large families arriving, families of 10, 12. It can be very hard to find units that are big enough. At the same time, we have single clients, and a 1-bedroom for a single client can be far too expensive. So what's the impact of this? The impact is that clients tend to all be placed in temporary housing upon arrival. So we're seeing that especially for the Afghan parolees that we're welcoming right now, because of the pace at which they have to be resettled into our communities, because it is an emergency response, we don't have time or resources to find permanent housing options for them right upon arrival. So they're getting placed into hotels or Airbnbs. We've been very lucky to have great partnerships with Airbnb and with some hotel chains to provide either no cost or discounted temporary housing options for our clients. But if those discounts are not available, this eats up that $1,225 budget right away. It also, really delays the services and the integration of the clients if they're placed into temporary housing and have to wait weeks or months before they can be placed into permanent housing. So, we do feel at this point within resettlement that we've kind of handled the temporary housing solutions. We have a ton of housing solutions that are temporary, but the permanent housing solutions is really where we're stuck right now, and really where we've faced this kind of crisis situation like we have never seen before in refugee resettlement. Another one of the impacts is huge amounts of staff time searching for viable permanent options, which takes away from time they have for other support services for refugee and parolee clients. Because of the corporatization of the rental application process, as I mentioned, we have fewer landlords willing to rent refugee clients. Again, taking away that personal connection and appealing to the humanity of landlords willing to rent to refugee clients. We have a computer system that's weeding clients out because they don't have the required background checks that are needed. And lastly, another impact of this is that we have had to force to place clients into more undesirable areas with higher crime rates and less access to transportation services and jobs. So this is something for refugee resettlement sphere that is, in terms of it being really a housing crisis, is quite new. So we are really searching for partnerships for advice for how to navigate this permanent housing solution. So I'm going to put my email in the chat. Would really love to connect with anybody at the local, national level that wants to learn more about the refugee resettlement process, and specifically how the housing issue is so apparent for refugees and parolees right now. I will say, in terms of the Afghan crisis, we're still welcoming Afghan parolees into our communities, and refugee arrivals are just starting to pick up again in this year right now, with a much higher resettlement goal than we've had in years past. So, this housing crisis is something that we're kind of managing with temporary housing funds right now, but really permanent solutions are what's needed for us. And we're hoping to connect and learn from some of these housing organizations on the call to think through some of these solutions. And happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Thank you for that report and for your phenomenal work. It's not surprising that you're having the issues that you're having. In the interest of time, there are a few questions in the Q&A. If you can just take a look at that and maybe answer your questions directly to those individuals. In the interest of time, I do think we're going to move on to our next presenter, but thank you so much for that presentation and for your great work.
Thank you.
Thanks a million. Okay, we are going to move on to our last field update with Ann Mabity. We do have somewhat limited time, but we definitely want to hear about the latest from Minnesota from one of our state partners, the Executive Director at Minnesota Housing Partnership, Ann Mabity. Take it away.
Thank you so much. I'll try to keep this snappy as we get this wonderful program to a conclusion. So I'm excited to talk about this to talk about our messaging campaign here in Minnesota that we've been doing this year, that really is about uplifting housing priorities and about unifying our housing stakeholders across Minnesota. We're calling it Yes to Invest. Invest in Minnesota, invest in families, invest in housing. We're asking for $2 billion in 2022. And we believe that investing $2 billion in 2022 legislative session for housing would be an investment in healthy families and children thriving in school and diverse and inclusive communities, in jobs and economic competitiveness, right? We all know this, that housing is absolutely essential to all of it. It's fundamental to having a prosperous state. And so in Minnesota, our legislative session began a week ago. And so we're beginning the sprint toward the various legislative deadlines for securing these funding investments. And we're framing our work around $2 billion for 2022. So one spark for doing this was a meeting this last December with our Speaker of the House of Representatives. We all know housing is complicated, right? There's federal, state, local governments that are involved from the public sector, private sector, and provides really most of our affordable housing, and nonprofits. And she said, I'm hearing about dozens of different housing requests. It's a lot. It's a lot of talk. How can you get your message on one page and put a human face on it? So we took that challenge seriously. And at the same time, our business leaders have been talking about housing as really a core issue for sustaining economic competitiveness. And so as housing champions, we've said, look, we are seeing historic state budget surpluses, not just for this year, but for future years. And we have federal emergency relief funding that the legislature needs to allocate as well. That's $1.6 billion. 7.7 billion is our state surplus. All of this is a lot of money, and it provides that platform to truly transform housing affordability in Minnesota. So this messaging campaign is a result of that. And so one of the things I just wanted to say too is we are focused on providing solutions. We have solutions, and we need to lead on solutions. We know what's needed to solve for this. We need to scale our requests for funding and investments to what the actual need is. I think we've always undersold what these challenges are. It's time to scale to what the actual need is. We believe that we need that clear housing messaging that unifies all of those proposals, and we need to bring in other sectors. All of this is work that most of you have probably been involved in. So let me just say on solutions-based, and you can see our handout here that we're really excited about that we're using. You know, housing advocates, me included, we spend a lot of time outlining all the challenges, all the shortfalls that exist in our housing systems. And it's important to document it and to understand that. But frankly, even I myself, I've given way too many presentations over the years that can end with this audience feeling sort of deflated and overwhelmed at what the scale of the gap is. So with this effort, we said we are solutions-based. If you look at the handout, you'll see that the invest in housing, $2 billion in 2022. If you go to the next page of this slide, $1 billion is to create and save homes. In the housing lingo, we talk about produce and preserve, but this is to create and save homes. And we've been very specific about what you get for your money, right? 8,000 families get new homes. We'd be able to preserve homes for 10,000 households. And according to the estimates that we've used from like the national home builders, the combination of these can create 22,000 jobs. The other billion is to create access and opportunity for housing. So the bulk of this request wraps up a whole bunch of different efforts and legislative proposals and campaigns, a bulk of which is creating a state level rental assistance program that would be available to every eligible cost burden renter. We call it Bring It Home. And in addition, it includes home buyer education, down payment assistance, and this really interesting, unique initiative to make sure that 5,000 first generation families get into home ownership. And of course, that's to address Minnesota's really shameful gap in home ownership rates between white households and households of color. So the governor last week, he announced, well, the week before and then last week announced bonding and supplemental budget proposals that from the administration side is historic. And yet it's what they're proposing is $1 billion over 3 years. Great. It means that they're prioritizing housing, but it's not enough. It does not scale to what we know is actually the need. And this incrementalism that we've been seeing over years and years and decades just means that we are in this constant state of crisis. So this year, when Minnesota Housing Finance Agency announced their funding awards that they do annually, they funded about 22 out of 66 or so shovel-ready projects, 22 out of 66 because of funding limitations. So we're saying it's time to invest in this. And what's really interesting about this campaign as well is that it's unifying all these different it's not a new program. It's saying all this work that housing advocates have done across the housing continuum, everyone still has to work on their own specific legislation for manufactured housing investments, for rental assistance, for home ownership, for naturally occurring affordable housing. We still need to work on that, but this helps clarify as an overall goal, $2 billion in 2022. So when we fund education, we don't say that we're only educating the first 25% of students who sign up for school, right? Or because the funding will run out. We don't do that. We say we will provide funding to educate all of our students. And we believe that same approach is needed for housing, that our state thrives when all Minnesota families have a safe, secure place to call home, and investing in housing make sure that we have that stability in housing, that there's choice for low-income renters, and that home ownership and wealth building opportunities are available for generations to come. And $2 billion is still less than 2% of our state's budget. So housing should not be a footnote. It's fundamental to a thriving state. And so we are very excited with this session beginning to see how this campaign, this messaging campaign, helps drive investments during this session.
Thank you so much, Anne. What a great campaign. What great communication pieces those are. It's really fantastic. I should have mentioned that Anne Mavity, in addition to being the executive director of Minnesota Housing Partnership, is an NLIC board member. So thank you very much for that, Anne. Okay, in the interest of time, we are going to move on to our last speaker, Sarah Hasmer from the National Women's Law Center, to talk about pulse survey data on housing insecurity. Sarah? I'll see if Sarah had to drop off. I'm afraid that maybe she had to. Inquiring with one of my teammates here. Did Sarah have to drop off?
Paul, she did not say anything about dropping off, but I also do not see her listed as a panelist right now.
Okay, very good. It's possible that she did have to drop off. I know she was available at 3:30. I don't know how long she was available. And I'm just want to make sure that we don't miss her if she comes back on. But I think we will go ahead and wrap. Since Sarah was the last presenter of the day, I just want to thank everybody, all of the participants, particularly all of the panelists and presenters. Phenomenal job. We really, really appreciate you presenting with us today. And remember, all of you, please continue to do everything that you can to reach out to your members of Congress about investing in bold affordable housing provisions in the Build Back Better Act. We need to get that across, and in the appropriations bill for FY22, a year-long continuing resolution would be disastrous. So please reach out to your members of Congress about those priorities. Thank you so much, and we will see you next week. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.